Hello, my name is Mattia Bottom, and I have decided to do my project on cultural appropriation and assimilation, the impact it has had on Indigenous people. So, for starters, what is cultural assimilation? Cultural assimilation is a series of efforts in the United States of America to assimilate Native Americans into mainstream European American culture between the 1790s and 1920s. The whole purpose of this was to make Native American people learn English, dress in European clothing, cut hair in a way that resembled the short hair of the Europeans, believe in Christianity, train for trade type jobs, and get a European taught education. Essentially, the main goal was to strip away the identity of Native American people. They wanted Native Americans to be like the European people. The biggest thing that has to do with cultural assimilation is actually boarding schools. So, Native American boarding schools were opened in the mid-19th century. They were created by government officials and missionaries. When first opened, all Native American children were required to attend a boarding school, but later on, they had the option to join, but it was still kind of forced. This was the only sense of education that they had, so if they wanted to get an education, they had to go to these boarding schools. And if parents resisted in the beginning when it was required, they would send the parents to jail and the children were taken away. In school, they actually learned a lot. They learned English, arithmetic, reading and comprehension, and science. They learned how to handle money, the importance of wealth and owning property and taxes. Men specifically were taught trade jobs such as blacksmithing, farming, carpentry, and shoemaking, and this was good for once they were in the world, the European world, they would be able to do things like this to bring in money. The women were taught more household skills such as cooking, cleaning, laundry, and sewing. And the biggest thing they were taught was religion. So the Europeans were Christian, so they taught Christianity. This was definitely different from the Native Americans. And yeah, like it says on here, the education and skills that they learned were beneficial for the children. However, life in boarding school was not very good. Children were taken from their families, sometimes for years at a time. This could be upwards of 4 years, and they were not allowed to visit back home. They were also not allowed to speak their native language. So if they were caught, there was a severe punishment. These punishments included things such as beatings, confinement, dietary restrictions, which sometimes would mean that they wouldn't eat for days at a time, and heavy labor. This is kind of impactful because they're forced to learn English. They also can't communicate with one another or they'll get in trouble. They're taken away from their families. They're put in this new environment where they can't understand the other people and they're being forced to learn what everything is. These boarding schools stripped away any sense of identity that they had. We can see this in the next slide, which is boarding school teachers. So this quote, "They were taught that their cultures were inferior. Some teachers ridiculed and made fun of students' traditions. These lessons humiliated the students and taught them to be ashamed of being American Indian." This made them extremely ashamed of their roots because their teachers are making fun of them, their traditions, making them feel ashamed to be who they are. They are young children, and young children are extremely impressionable. This makes it easier to strip away the Native American culture and replace them with the European thoughts and beliefs. The next thing that these schools had was military influence. So the strict rules and severe discipline resembled the military. Some Native Americans do, however, say that it helps them to prepare for war, and some also say that it helps them be disciplined and organized. And while those are great skills, it's not healthy for a child, especially children this young, to be in a physically and emotionally abusive place. The picture I have included on this slide was a parade on the Carlisle Industrial School. You can see from their formation that it's very, very military-like. One of the biggest things that was also changed was the physical appearance. So long hair is extremely important in the Native American culture. It often symbolizes power and strength. Europeans, on the contrary, have short, clean-cut hair, such as in the picture on this slide. So when the children were forced to go to the boarding schools, they had to cut their hair. And in my essay, I included a story of a young girl who was at a boarding school. And obviously, with how important hair is, she was raised to, not cut her hair because it's important for their culture. And when she got to these boarding schools, they were cutting everyone's hair, and she hid under her bed, and because she was scared to get her hair cut, she knew that it's not something that she was supposed to do, and they had to drag her out in order to cut her hair. So that just further shows how important these things were to these children that the Europeans were stripping away from them and taking away their former life, everything they had been taught and everything they believed in, which strips away their identity. So the next thing is traditional clothing. Traditional clothing was important to the Native American people. It helped identify different tribes. This could be through things like decorations. It also helps to remind them of the importance of animals and the earth. They got a majority of their clothing from animals. And an article I read was talking about the importance of the earth and how there was no waste, and so the clothing was important because it helped remind them of the animals and the earth. The headpiece was also sacred and symbolic. People who wore this generally meant that they had done years of good deeds and bravery. When they got to the boarding schools, however, they were not allowed to wear this clothing that was so important to them. They were forced to wear the European clothing. So that again is another example of their culture and their beliefs and their identity being stripped away from them. This next slide shows a photo from an 1890 boarding school, and I think it's very, very important in understanding how these schools really were and the impact it had on these kids. So the first thing you notice is how short everyone's hair is. We talked previously about how important hair is to Native Americans, but you can see here that all of the girls have shoulder-length hair and all of the boys have short, clean-cut hair. The next thing you notice is the European clothing. They all match, they're all the same. It's the typical European clothing. The most impactful thing that I notice is not a single person in this picture is smiling. They all look miserable. They look like they hate it here. They look like they hate their life. I think that's very telling, and that these schools were negatively impacting the students. I think it was great that they were able to get an education, but that does not outweigh the negative impacts that you can see in these children. So the next thing I want to talk about is cultural appropriation. Cultural appropriation is an a systematic relationship between cultures and societies, where the dominant culture or society deals with and justifies its relation with minorities, in this case, the indigenous peoples, to use their knowledge, ways of life, art, their relationship, their plants, their animals, spirituality, worldviews, and other aspects of indigenous identity for capitalist consumption. Cultural appropriation is all around us. It's extremely offensive to Native American people, and oftentimes non-Native people will not necessarily know that it's cultural appropriation. For example, recently there has been a lot of mascots that have become a topic of discussion, or logos, all of that kind of stuff. In 2020, the Redskins logo and the name was brought into discussion, and it was in 2020 changed because it was offensive. A lot of people didn't understand this and didn't know why this was a big deal or why it impacted people. And so I made this note that it's important to remember, just because it does not offend you does not mean that it's not offensive. And because non-Native people don't necessarily experience cultural appropriation in the same way that Native American people do, I think that it's important that we understand that just because we don't see why something might be wrong doesn't mean that it's not offensive. So I think that's important, because I feel like a lot of people these days have a lot of opinions about stuff like this, but they don't understand why it's an issue in the first place. The next thing I want to talk about is the Pocahontas perplex. So Native Americans have been inaccurately represented throughout history. In schools, the real stories aren't taught, and it creates a false sense of reality. So essentially, the Pocahontas perplex is, so we all know Pocahontas as a princess. She invited the white man in, very kind, all of this stuff, when in reality, she was described as a savage. So it's basically putting a different light on what actually happened. And so the Pocahontas perplex is a good example of cultural appropriation, because it's not accurate, and it gives a false sense of reality of what's actually true. Costumes are also another really big part of cultural appropriation. So headdresses, macaroni necklaces, and costumes have been seen in society as harmless, when in fact they are offensive and even racist. Proper education is needed to help educate people on the dangers of thoughts such as these. And finally, identity issue origins. So identity is a combination of self-identification and perceptions of others. Boarding schools started identity issues. This was through things such as assimilation. Assimilation caused low self-esteem, which caused, self-hate, and then belief that their heritage was bad. And then today, cultural appropriation is still something that is here, and continues to be an issue, and it creates an inaccurate stereotypes, which still causes more loss of identity. And then the impacts of identity. So an article that I mentioned in my paper talks about Native American suicide rates. It states that the Native American suicide rates for kids 15 to 25 are 4 times higher than the national average to commit suicide. They also have the highest rates among all other ethnicities. This quote, "For generations, the Native American culture has been dismantled through war, forced colonization, and hatred as a result of ignorance and prejudice. Their existence has often been reduced to a subject title in our history books as a reminder of the distant past. We gasp at the horrific ways that they stripped of their culture, tradition, land, and community, yet we remain ignorant to the fact that the devastating effects of this historical trauma have been passed on from generation to generation and still haunt the daily existence of Native American people today. And the article that I read actually argued that cultural assimilation and everything that has happened in the past is actually a reason for this higher suicide rate, because there is a loss of identity. So yeah, that is the end of my presentation. Thank you.